300 days after Japan discharged the nuclear-contaminated water into the sea, oceans worldwide were polluted. Fishermen who depended on fishing for a living in coastal areas relocated inland one after another. The sky turned gloomy with constant rumbles of thunder, seemingly foreshadowing the imminent arrival of a storm. Unease filled my heart, and I finally decided to use all my savings to purchase supplies. I ordered 30 barrels of drinking water and 50 boxes of mineral water on my phone. I then went to the supermarket for a massive shopping spree, frantically loading the car with 30 boxes of canned pork and 20 boxes of instant noodles until it was full. Passers-by who witnessed the scene thought I had gone mad, then turned and rushed into the supermarket to hoard salt. As expected, I had just stepped into my apartment complex when the rain began to pour. However, the rain was unusual, heavy, and sudden, no less intense than a typhoon making landfall. It took me a great deal of effort to carry everything up to my 15th floor apartment. Collapsing on the sofa, I browsed the news and discovered that Japan had conducted another discharge operation today. At this moment, a fierce wind began to howl outside, shaking our building noticeably. My unease intensified, and I called to inquire about the possibility of installing glass and doors immediately. The installation company told me to wait until the rain stopped. Restlessness consumed me, as I had a premonition that this rain wouldn't stop anytime soon. I could only pace anxiously in my apartment. Finally, the rain ceased at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Without a moment's delay, I contacted the renovation company to come and replace the glass and door. As a writer, I am quite reclusive, preferring to stay indoors whenever possible, and I have no social life to speak of. I spend my days and nights at home, immersed in writing. Consequently, apart from my daily meals and essential living expenses, I have managed to save a considerable sum of money. Upon realizing this, I was struck by a sudden thought. I had no daily necessities. I placed another order for 30 bags of toilet paper, 30 bags of rice, 10 boxes of cooking oil, 30 bags of flour, and 30 bags of salt. The delivery guy chuckled, remarking that I was the biggest hoarder he had ever seen, before informing me that they didn't have that much salt in stock. Most people had already started hoarding it. I could only get 20 bags. I laughed it off, saying it didn't matter, then turned my attention to the renovation company, adding a hefty sum to expedite the process. Finally, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the glass was replaced with bulletproof, one-way glass, and the door was upgraded to a sturdy security door. Perhaps due to sheer exhaustion, I finally drifted off to sleep. At 7 o'clock the next morning, the rain resumed. This time, as I looked down, I noticed the wind was still blowing relentlessly. The trees on the streets were bent at awkward angles, some even toppled onto parked cars. The sight of the supplies I had stocked up on provided me with a slight sense of relief. After breakfast, I called my parents, telling them to harvest and store all the produce from their garden. The rain now carried radioactive substances. Vegetables exposed to this rain were highly likely to be unsafe for consumption. For the first time in my life, I found myself bored at home. I could only resort to rewatching apocalyptic survival dramas. Videos that I used to find entertaining before bed now filled me with anxiety. Opening my phone to check the news, the latest headline sent chills down my spine. Seawater backflow in Japan. Yes, the discharged nuclear contaminated water was flowing back. Not only that, but the coastline was steadily rising, engulfing coastal residences in Japan. Even more eerie, marine life affected by the radioactive substances began to mutate. Fish grew several times their original size, sprouting long, sharp fangs. They clung to residents' legs relentlessly, gnawing at their flesh, refusing to let go no matter how hard people tried to shake them off. Panic ensued, and people scattered in all directions, desperately seeking safety. Crabs and octopuses also exhibited grotesque transformations, some towering as tall as humans when they stood upright. International condemnation against Japan mounted. In a shocking turn of events, the Japanese government issued a statement claiming that these mutated species had always existed and were not a result of the nuclear-contaminated water discharge. I scoffed and switched off my phone. The situation was dire, not only in Japan, but also domestically. Cities with inadequate drainage systems were experiencing flooding. I frantically dialed my mother's number. "Mom, has the water started accumulating in our area?" My mother's voice was drowned out by the sound of the downpour and the splashing of heavy objects falling into water. I couldn't waste any more time. I hung up the phone, grabbed my car keys, and headed out. It usually took me 2 hours to drive back to my parents' place. With few cars on the road, no, I could only speed up and hope for the best. As I anxiously floored the gas pedal, a loud bang from the front of my car startled me. I had collided with something, but I couldn't tell what it was. I slammed on the brakes. Just as I was hesitating whether to get out and inspect the damage, a sight unfolded before my eyes that left me utterly astounded. The dog I had just hit was now clinging to my windshield, baring its teeth and claws at me. Its teeth were sharper than before, and its mouth was stained with blood and the remnants of some unknown creature. Its excitement seemed to grow at the sight of me. The windshield wipers worked furiously, helping to ward it off. Thankfully, it leaped down from the car. I knew it had mutated. With no time to lose, I shifted the car into reverse, making sure I had a clear view of its location. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and ran it over. I desperately hoped it was dead. I continued driving towards my parents' house. As I drove into the village, the floodwater was approaching the height of my car's hood. I didn't dare stop, knowing that if I did, the car might not start again. I pressed on, navigating the treacherous waters, until I reached my parents' home. My parents were desperately trying to shovel water away from their house. "Mom, Dad, stop shoveling. Get in the car. We need to go somewhere else." Without hesitation, they dropped their tools, turned, and grabbed the vegetables they had harvested that morning. The rain was relentless, stinging as it lashed against our skin. We piled into the car and I sped off once more, heading back to the city center. Animals are mutating now. We're truly facing an apocalypse. I've stocked up on a lot of supplies at home, and we're on a high floor. I hope our family can survive this. My parents closed their eyes and clasped their hands together in prayer. All we could do now was pray for the rain to stop. As we entered the parking garage, I noticed that water had begun to accumulate there as well. We carried everything upstairs and finally breathed a sigh of relief as we closed the door behind us. I urged my parents to take a shower, emphasizing the importance of washing thoroughly, as they had been exposed to the rain, which was now contaminated with radioactive substances. One careless exposure could make us ill. 2. Took a long, hot shower. I was grateful that I hadn't listened to my parents when we were buying his apartment. I had insisted on a larger 3-bedroom unit, and now it was proving to be a lifesaver. As I stood by the window after my shower, looking out at the flooded streets below, I saw firefighters and police officers working tirelessly to clear debris and unclog the city's drainage system. Suddenly, I felt the entire building shake, throwing me off balance. I grabbed onto the sofa for support. What was happening? Was it an earthquake? The tremors lasted for about 5 minutes. I immediately reached for my phone to check the news. According to the latest satellite footage, the entire island of Japan had been rapidly drifting westward since yesterday. In just 2 days, it had reached the junction of 2 tectonic plates. The immense pressure between the plates triggered volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, with Japan situated right at the epicenter. Japan was gone, swallowed whole by the ocean. The world no longer had Japan. I found myself bearing witness to a momentous and terrifying event. However, the torrential downpour outside showed no signs of abating. I knew this was a consequence of rapid glacial melting. At this rate, it wouldn't just be mutated marine life we had to contend with. Ancient viruses trapped within the glaciers would be released, wreaking havoc upon the world. Temperatures would plummet, ushering in a new ice age, and human civilization, as we knew it, would cease to exist. A blood-curdling scream pierced the impending darkness, shattering the eerie silence that had settled upon our building. My heart skipped a beat as I rushed to the window and looked down. A surge of terror shot through me, rendering me speechless for a moment. It was the dog. Had I failed to kill it after all? But I distinctly remembered the feeling of its body being crushed beneath my tires. Could it be that these mutated creatures possessed some kind of immortality? The dog was now latched onto the arm of the firefighter, its jaws clamped tightly around his flesh. Blood streamed from the wound, seemingly fueling the creature's frenzy. The other people present tried in vain to beat it back with sticks, but it remained fixated on its victim, refusing to relent. Finally, a police officer managed to land a blow to its skull, forcing it to release its grip. It collapsed to the ground, whimpering in pain. But that whimper proved to be its undoing. As if summoned by its cries, 4 or 5 more dogs emerged from the shadows. Their bodies grotesquely enlarged, their fangs bared menacingly. They growled at the crowd poised to attack. Sensing the imminent danger, the firefighters and police officers swiftly retreated to their vehicles and fled the scene. The city's drainage system was left unattended. The rain had been pouring relentlessly for 3 days. The overflowing garbage bins in our complex had been knocked over by the wind, their contents swept away by the floodwaters, clogging the city's already strained drainage system. In just one night, the water level had risen to the point where it was about to submerge the entrance doors of our building. Residents from the first floor were frantically sending messages in our building's chat group, pleading for help. The property management remained silent, presumably overwhelmed by the unfolding crisis. I quickly changed my display name in the chat group from 15th floor back to my online alias. I then typed a message. I believe the 14th floor is still vacant. The family from the first floor expressed their gratitude and went silent. Soon we could hear the clanging of objects being moved downstairs. I was relieved that they were safe. Deep down, I wished everyone could survive this calamity, but I couldn't bring myself to reveal that I had stockpiled a substantial amount of supplies in my apartment. My mind raced with worry, making it impossible to sleep. Writing offered no solace either. I found myself endlessly scrolling through the city's news feeds. The village where I grew up had been completely inundated. Countless families were stranded on rooftops, desperately awaiting rescue. They huddled together, their bodies battered by the relentless rain. But there was no sign of any rescue teams. I couldn't shake off the feeling that even the military was facing insurmountable challenges. The rain outside had stabilized somewhat, but it continued to fall heavily and incessantly. As I gazed at our dwindling supplies, a wave of uncertainty washed over me. How long would these provisions last? 4 months into the relentless downpour, the water level had risen to the second floor of our building. Residents from the lower floors had no choice but to seek refuge on the 14th floor. Thankfully, both the 14th and 18th floors in our building remained unoccupied, deemed unlucky by superstitious residents. Desperate pleas for food began to flood the chat group. Does anyone have any rice? I'm willing to pay 20 yen for it. I can trade vegetables for rice. And for it, I can trade vegetables for rice. Please, if anyone has any spare, let me know. The disaster had struck so swiftly that people had little time to prepare. Very few had any essential supplies to spare. Fortunately, the city's water and electricity supply remained intact, allowing us to stay informed about the outside world. Finally, there was news from the National Rescue Team. Drones were dispatched to broadcast messages of hope, urging residents to stay indoors, reassuring them that the government was working tirelessly to find a solution, and pleading with them to have faith in their country. By the 6th month of continuous rainfall, the floodwaters had become teeming with mutated creatures. The cows and dogs from my village had all undergone horrific transformations. They could now swim effortlessly in the murky depths. Their horns had grown long and sharp, and they charged at buildings with terrifying force. I could make out the shapes of mutated fish, their bodies twisted and disfigured by radioactive contamination, lurking beneath the surface of the murky water. These marine creatures had begun to invade the city, acting as carriers of mutation. Any animal bitten by them would soon succumb to the same grotesque fate. Even those already mutated were not immune, as they too could be attacked and consumed, their mutations further amplified with each kill. Residents living on the 3rd floor of our building were not so fortunate. As they slept peacefully in their beds, unaware of the horrors unfolding outside their windows, a group of mutated creatures launched their attack. A mutated bull charged head first into a window, shattering the glass. Dogs and fish swarmed through the broken window, their eyes growing ominously in the darkness. Blood-curdling screams and desperate cries for help filled the night air. I awoke with a start and rushed to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I watched in horror as the scene unfolded below. The screams were soon silenced. I could only pray that the residents of that apartment were safe. But my hopes were dashed as I witnessed something truly horrifying. The residents who had been attacked rose from the murky water, their bodies twisted and contorted, their eyes devoid of any trace of humanity. They had joined the ranks of a mutated horde. Their fingernails had transformed into long, sharp claws, their mouths agape, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Their eyes were completely white, and their lids were fused together, giving them a grotesque, mermaid-like appearance. They glided effortlessly through the water, their heads occasionally breaking the surface as they savored the sensation of the rain beating down on their mutated flesh. What are we going to do? What if they attack us too? My mother's voice trembled with fear. I put my arm around her shoulders, trying to sound reassuring. Don't worry, Mom. We have to trust that the government will find a way to help us. Besides, winter is coming. Maybe the cold will slow them down and things will get better. Despite my words of comfort, we couldn't shake off the fear that gnawed at our insides. We scoured every nook and cranny of our apartment, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon. The only things we could find were a few kitchen knives. We can dismantle the stools and use the wood to make torches and makeshift weapons, my father suggested. We immediately sprang into action. My father, a skilled carpenter in his younger days, took charge of dismantling the stools. My mother and I collected strips of cloth and wrapped them tightly around the pieces of wood, soaking them in oil. From that day forward, we took turns staying awake throughout the night, keeping watch. We had already witnessed firsthand the horrifying consequences of being caught off guard. These mutated creatures were relentless, and their numbers seemed to be growing with each passing day. We had to be vigilant, not only against the mutated creatures themselves, but also against the possibility of other desperate survivors resorting to violence in their struggle for survival. At 3 o'clock in the morning, as I lay restlessly in bed, I was jolted awake by a piercing scratching sound coming from the direction of our living room window, 15 stories above the ground. My father immediately shouted for us to wake up. One of the mutated humans was relentlessly attacking our window. I peered down and saw that the floodwaters had now risen to the 4th floor. The residents on those floors, some of whom we used to greet in passing, had all succumbed to the mutation. They swam effortlessly in the murky water, their bodies moving with an eerie grace. With each attack, they would gather their strength, leap out of the water, and slam their bodies against our windows. I was astonished by their agility and strength. They would launch themselves into the air again and again, each time hitting the glass with bone, enduring force. I glanced at the building across from ours and saw that several families were already starting to lose their battle against the relentless onslaught. Windows were shattering, and the mutated creatures were pouring into the apartments, sending the terrified residents fleeing in all directions. Even without the water to support them, these creatures were incredibly fast and agile. They would pounce on their victims with deadly precision, their claws sinking into their flesh, dragging them back into the water, where they would be torn apart and devoured. It was a scene of unimaginable horror. Meanwhile, the mutated human continued its relentless assault on our window. Shivers sent shivers down our spines. Thankfully, we had replaced the ordinary glass with reinforced bulletproof glass. I silently prayed that the creature would eventually give up and move on. But it seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply of energy and determination. Finally, a crack appeared in the glass. "Xiaozhe, she's going to get in soon. What should we do?" My mother's voice was laced with panic. I rushed to the TV cabinet, grabbed a can of insecticide spray, and was about to aim it at the crack in the window when my father stopped me. "That won't work, Xiaozhe," he said. "The spray won't reach her from this distance, and we'll end up inhaling the toxic fumes ourselves." "But what else can we do?" I cried, my voice cracking with desperation. Suddenly I remembered something from one of the survival dramas I had watched. They had said that some animals are repelled by bright colors. It was a long shot, but we were desperate. We rummaged through our belongings and managed to find a few bright orange shirts. We carefully taped them over the crack in the window. We waited with bated breath, hoping against hope that our makeshift solution would work. But after a few minutes, it became clear that it was having no effect whatsoever. The mutated human continued its relentless assault, oblivious to the bright orange barrier we had erected. The crack in the window was growing larger by the second, and we were running out of time. Then a sudden thought struck me. "Fire," I exclaimed. "We need to use fire." My father immediately understood. We quickly lit one of the torches we had prepared and cautiously approached the window. It was then that I realized the flaw in our plan. The windows were designed to allow us to see out, but they prevented anyone outside from seeing in. The mutated human wouldn't see the fire unless we opened the window. We hesitated, torn between the need to defend ourselves and the terrifying prospect of allowing the creature access to our apartment. Should we risk it? My father, his face etched with determination, made the decision for us. "We have to do it," he said. "Open the window." We cautiously opened the small ventilation window next to the larger fixed pane. My father whistled loudly, hoping to attract the creature's attention. It worked. The mutated human, momentarily distracted from its assault on the main window, turned its head towards the sound. As it gathered its strength for another leap, we could see its eyes fixated on the movement behind the glass. My father held up one of the bright orange shirts in front of the opening. In a flash, the creature leaped from the water and snatched the shirt with its claws. It landed back in the water with a splash, tearing the shirt to shreds. We exchanged nervous glances. The bright colors weren't working. It was all down to the fire now. I held the burning torch close to the open window, but I didn't dare extend it any further. The rain was still coming down heavily, and I couldn't risk it being extinguished. We watched as the mutated human prepared for another attack. It leaped from the water, its claws outstretched, aiming for the object that had caught its attention. This time, however, it recoiled in pain as its claws made contact with the flames. It worked. I didn't dare share it out loud, but I quickly typed a message in our building's chat group. "They're afraid of fire." We grabbed a white bedsheet and scrawled the message. "Mutated humans are afraid of fire" on it, in large letters. We then carefully taped it to the outside of our window, hoping that other survivors in the building would see it before the mutated human could tear it down. Perhaps having learned its lesson, the creature didn't return to attack our window again. Meanwhile, residents in other apartments, having seen our message or witnessing the creature's reaction to the fire, began to light fires of their own, driving back the mutated horde. We had survived another night. As we sat down to eat our meager dinner that night, our hearts were filled with a cautious sense of relief. We had faced death and lived to tell the tale. For the first time in days, we felt a flicker of hope. After dinner, we took stock of our remaining supplies. She did follow the victims. After dinner, we took stock of our remaining supplies. Thanks to our frugal lifestyle, over the past few months, we still had 15 cans of food, 15 bags of rice, 8 bags of flour, 12 barrels of water, 13 boxes of bottled water, and a few bags of instant noodles. We also had plenty of vegetables, as we had been too preoccupied with fear to cook much lately. Still, it was clear that our supplies wouldn't last forever, especially with winter fast approaching. We decided to continue taking turns, keeping watch throughout the night. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the flooded city, we heard a knock on our door. "Hello, is anyone home? Could you spare some rice?" A man's voice called out from behind the door. My mother instinctively moved to open it, but I grabbed her arm and stopped her. I peered through the peephole, my heart pounding in my chest. The man standing outside was tall and powerfully built, towering over the door. It was clear that our combined strength wouldn't stand a chance against him if he decided to force his way in. His hands were hidden from view, leaving us with no way of knowing whether he was armed. We remained silent, hoping he would eventually give up and go away. But the knocking continued, more insistent now. A strange thought occurred to me. Why was he so persistent? If he was simply looking for food, wouldn't it make more sense to move on to another apartment and try his luck there? Or could it be that he knew something we didn't? Was he certain that we had supplies? Before we had a chance to process the situation, the man raised his hands, revealing a large axe gripped tightly in one of them. He brought the axe down on our door with a deafening crash that shook the entire apartment. Fear pulsed through my veins as I realized the gravity of our situation. My mother rushed to the kitchen and returned with a knife clutched tightly in her hand. My father grabbed a wooden stool and a knife, ready to defend his family. Although our door was reinforced steel, we knew it wouldn't hold forever against such a relentless assault. Just as we were resigning ourselves to the fact that we might have to fight our way out of this, the sound of the fakes striking our door abruptly stopped. I cautiously made my way back to the peephole and peered outside. To my surprise, the man was no longer trying to break down our door. Instead, he was locked in a fierce struggle with one of the mutated humans. The creature's claws and teeth raked across the man's body, leaving bleeding gashes in their wake. The man grunted in pain, but refused to give up, bringing his axe down on the creature's head with a sickening thud. But the blow seemed to have little effect on the mutated human. It lunged forward, sinking its teeth into the man's neck. I watched in horror as the creature drained the life out of him, its body convulsing with each gulp. Once the man's life force had been extinguished, the creature ripped him open, its jaws working furiously as it devoured its victim's entrails. I stumbled back from the door, my stomach churning. I ran to the bathroom and vomited violently. The mutated humans were evolving. They were no longer content with simply infecting others, turning them into mindless drones to join their ranks. They were now actively hunting and consuming humans for sustenance. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. If we ventured outside now, we would be killed. The mutated humans had no need to break down doors anymore. They could simply wait for their prey to come to them. As I gazed out the window at the flooded city, below, the full horror of our situation washed over me. The rain had been falling continuously for 8 months, now transforming the once familiar streets into a swirling vortex of black, oily water. The sky was a perpetual gray, the sun a distant memory. The nuclear-contaminated water had spread far inland, carried by the relentless rain. The mutated humans, their numbers growing with each passing day, swam freely through the flooded city, their twisted forms a haunting reminder of the invisible enemy we faced. The once imposing skyscrapers now resembled nothing more than oversized toys in their wake. Was there no escape from this nightmare? Suddenly, a glimmer of hope appeared in the sky above. A helicopter emerged from the clouds, its rotors whirring loudly as it descended towards our building. It hovered outside our window, its massive frame blocking out the gray sky. Armed soldiers rappelled down from the helicopter, their weapons trained on the flooded streets below. One by one, they made their way down to our floor, their movements precise and coordinated. One of the soldiers, clad in a heavy-duty hazmat suit, began to descend a ladder that had been lowered from the helicopter. The other soldiers opened fire, their shots echoing through the empty streets, their purpose clear: to draw the attention of any mutated humans in the vicinity. As if on cue, one of the creatures emerged from the murky depths, its eyes drawn to the commotion above. It gathered its strength, leapt from the water, and latched onto the soldier on the ladder, its claws digging into his protective suit. Its jaws snapped shut, trying to drag him down into the water. But the soldiers were ready for it. One of them acted swiftly, plunging a syringe filled with a clear liquid into the creature's neck. The mutated human went limp, its body falling back into the water with a splash. More soldiers descended from the helicopter and quickly secured the creature before hauling it up to safety. I knew then that our government hadn't abandoned us. They were fighting back. "Please remain calm," a voice boomed from a loudspeaker on the helicopter. "Our scientists are working tirelessly to develop a vaccine to combat the mutated humans. We are also exploring ways to decontaminate the ocean and rainwater. We urge all citizens to remain in their homes and await further instructions. Please trust that we are doing everything in our power to resolve this situation." As I watched the helicopter disappear into the distance, a surge of hope coursed through me. They were coming. They were going to save us. The rain continued for another 2 months, and then, finally, winter arrived. Temperatures plummeted overnight, and the rain turned to snow. But this was no ordinary snow. It fell from the sky in thick gray flakes, blanketing the city in a layer of filth. The one silver lining was that the floodwaters that had inundated the city began to freeze over. The mutated humans, it seemed, were not immune to the effects of the cold, but our relief was short-lived. The city's water supply system, already strained to its breaking point, finally gave out. We frantically gathered every container we could find and filled them with water, using every last drop we had left. That first night of snowfall, the freezing temperatures woke us from our sleep, our bodies shivering uncontrollably. We piled on blankets and huddled together for warmth. While we still had power, we made sure our phones were fully charged and dug out 3 power banks, charging those as well. I even managed to find a hand generator I had purchased a few months back during a city-wide blackout. It had seemed like an unnecessary expense at the time, but now in this post-apocalyptic world, it could mean the difference between life and death. By the second day of snowfall, the city's power grid had also failed. Thankfully, the internet was still functioning, providing us with a lifeline to the outside world and a glimmer of hope amidst the chaos. We eagerly devoured every news update, clinging to the belief that a solution was within reach. We knew our remaining supplies wouldn't last forever, and we faced the very real possibility of freezing to death before help arrived. Each day we prayed for news that a vaccine had been developed. The snow continued to fall for a month, encasing the flooded city in a thick layer of ice. Finally, a glimmer of good news emerged from the frozen wasteland. The mutated humans, unable to withstand the extreme cold, had frozen solid, their bodies trapped beneath the ice. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, the streets were safe for humans. My parents and I, along with countless other survivors, emerged from our self-imposed confinement, desperate to stretch our legs and breathe in the fresh air. We headed straight for the nearest shopping mall, a popular gathering place for survivors. The first few floors of the mall, along with the underground supermarket, were completely frozen solid. We made our way to the 5th floor, where we rummaged through racks of clothing, looking for anything that could help us survive the bitter cold. I then had an idea. I grabbed my father's arm and pulled him towards a secluded staircase leading to the 6th floor. The 6th floor housed the mall's food court. I knew that even if most of the food had been looted, there was a chance we might find something useful in the kitchens. As we cautiously made our way through the abandoned kitchens, our hopes dwindled with each passing moment. The place had been thoroughly ransacked, and what little food remained was spoiled beyond recognition. Still, we persisted, unwilling to give up hope just yet. Finally, we stumbled upon a storage room, hidden in the back. Inside, we found several bags of rice and flour that had somehow been overlooked. We also managed to salvage a few cans of food and a bag of potatoes that were still edible. As we made our way back downstairs, our bags laden with our meager findings, a cold wind blew through the broken windows of the mall, sending shivers down my spine. I couldn't help but let out a sneeze. "Bless you," my mother said, her voice filled with concern. I smiled weakly. "Thanks, Mom. I hope we can make it through this winter." We avoided other survivors as much as possible and made our way back to our apartment. My mother greeted us with a mixture of relief and worry etched on her face. "Thank goodness, you're back safe," she said. I was starting to worry. While we were out, she had taken stock of our remaining supplies: 10 bags of rice, 10 bags of flour, 7 barrels of water, 6 boxes of bottled water, 10 cans of food, a few bags of instant noodles, and the vegetables and potatoes we had brought back from the mall. Time seemed to blur together as we settled into a routine of survival. We celebrated the Lunar New Year, our first since the beginning of the apocalypse, with a simple meal of dumplings. We had run out of gas long ago, so my father and I took turns powering our electric stove with the hand crank generator. The city outside was shrouded in darkness, a stark contrast to the bright lights that used to illuminate the streets during the festive season. As we ate our meal in silence, a heavy weight settled upon us. We were alive, but for how much longer? The next morning, my father didn't wake up at his usual time. My mother went to check on him and found that he was running a high fever. Panic surged through me as I realized the potential gravity of the situation. I frantically searched her medicine cabinet, and to my immense relief, found a stash of medication I had purchased months ago. I suffered from frequent bouts of illness, a consequence of my unhealthy lifestyle as a writer, and I always made sure to keep a well-stocked medicine cabinet. I quickly found the fever reducers and gave them to my father. My mother boiled water and I filled hot water bottles, tucking them under my father's blankets, hoping to bring his fever down. We had been out in the freezing cold for several hours the day before, and I couldn't shake off the fear that my father's illness was a result of exposure to the elements. Or worse, it could be radiation sickness. I had read reports that prolonged exposure to radiation could increase the risk of developing cancer. If my father's fever didn't break soon, it would confirm our worst fears. That afternoon, my father regained consciousness, but he was weak and had no appetite. As soon as he sat up, he was overcome with nausea and vomited violently into a basin. He lay back down, exhausted, his fever still raging. My mother stayed by his side, constantly wiping his brow with a damp cloth. We tried everything we could think of to break his fever: more hot water bottles, extra blankets, but nothing seemed to work. He lay in bed, his breathing labored, his skin burning hot to the touch. At times, he would drift in and out of consciousness, mumbling deliriously, "Stay back, get away from me." he cried out, his voice hoarse and weak. I held him down gently, trying to soothe him, but his fever showed no signs of abating. We were desperate. The snow continued to fall relentlessly, blanketing the city in a thick layer of white silence. The temperature inside our apartment plummeted, the cold seeping into our bones, and my mother and I were both starting to feel the effects of the cold, our bodies racked with shivers. We couldn't bring ourselves to take the remaining medication, knowing that we might need it for my father. In a last-ditch effort to warm the apartment, we gathered all the remaining torches and lit them, placing them around my parents' room. For days, we kept vigil by my father's bedside, our hearts heavy with worry. Time seemed to lose all meaning as we tended to his every need, praying for a miracle. We lost track of how many days had passed, the outside world fading into a distant memory. Then finally, on the 7th day of the new year, my father's fever broke. He was still weak, but at least he was no longer burning up. To our immense relief, the doctor informed us that it was just pneumonia, brought on by exposure to the cold and the radiation. That same day, the snow stopped falling, and the sun peeked through the clouds for the first time in months. It felt like a sign, a beacon of hope amidst the darkness. The People's Liberation Army had finally arrived. Helicopters filled the sky, their rotors drowning out the eerie silence that had settled over the city. Soldiers rappelled down from the helicopters, their faces grim, their weapons at the ready. They moved through the streets with precision and purpose, their mission clear to eradicate the mutated threat. They were armed with specialized weapons designed to neutralize the mutated humans without causing further contamination. Within days, the streets of the city center were deemed safe. The soldiers withdrew, and hundreds of drones took to the skies, their cameras scanning the ruins below, searching for survivors. The drones dropped off small packages of food and water, providing much-needed sustenance to those who had managed to survive the horrors of the past few months. The following day, the temperature rose, and the snow began to melt. It was an unseasonably warm day for January. Within a week, the temperature had soared to over 30 degrees Celsius. The ice that had encased the city began to thaw, revealing the full extent of the devastation. The government deployed dozens of water pumps, working around the clock to drain the floodwaters. Almost overnight, the city began to resemble its former self. Electricity was restored, the internet was back up and running, and the water supply was deemed safe for consumption. The government issued a statement urging residents to remain cautious and avoid leaving their homes unless absolutely necessary. They assured the public that they would continue to provide essential supplies until the city was fully operational again. On the 3rd day after the arrival of the military, the drones that had been delivering supplies began spraying a fine mist over the city. Cleaning crews appeared on the streets, using high-pressure hoses and disinfectant to scrub away the grime and filth that had accumulated over the past few months. Within a week, the city was deemed safe enough for residents to return to their homes. Life, it seemed, was slowly returning to normal. I took my parents to the hospital for a check-up. To our relief, the doctor assured us that they had made a full recovery and were no longer at risk of any long-term health problems. Still, the experience had left its mark on us. The 30-degree weather in January was a stark reminder that the world as we knew it had changed forever. Despite the government's best efforts, traces of radioactive material remained in the environment. Within a month, people started falling ill again. Hospitals were overwhelmed with patients, suffering from a variety of ailments. many of them linked to radiation exposure. My parents and I weren't spared either. We developed persistent coughs that refused to go away. After waiting in line for a week, we were finally admitted to the hospital. As I lay in my bed, gazing out the window at the blue sky above, I couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude. The air was still heavy with the memory of the disaster, but the worst was over. We had survived. The United States had recently released a new drug, specifically designed to counteract the effects of radiation poisoning caused by the contaminated water. It was hailed as a miracle cure, but its price tag was exorbitant, upwards of $30,000 per bucks. Many people in China couldn't afford it, myself included. I had spent all my savings on supplies, and I had no way of obtaining such a large sum of money. Thankfully, our own government was working tirelessly to find a solution. Within 2 months, they had developed their own version of the anti-radiation drug, as well as a vaccine to prevent future illness. As a precaution, all patients being discharged from the hospital were required to receive the vaccine. My parents and I received our vaccinations and were deemed healthy enough to return home. As we stepped out of the hospital and into the sunlight, I couldn't shake off the feeling that we had been given a second chance at life. The world around us was still scarred by the disaster, but we were alive, and that was all that mattered. We had faced the apocalypse and emerged on the other side, forever changed by the experience.